Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. On this show, I'm going to do something a little different. No guests, no long videos. But stay tuned because the subject for today is something that affects every one of us. You, me, your family, your friends, literally everyone you know. Well, it concerns this, your money. My money, the money that you hope to have someday, and the money that allows you to keep your family fed, keep a roof over your head, and clothes on your back. And to make it more interesting, this subject, what we're about to talk about, is something that I guarantee you not one person in 10,000, maybe not one in 100,000, have ever heard about. I'm talking about what controls your money, what determines how much that dollar in your wallet is actually worth. You might have heard about something called the Federal Reserve. It's been around now for 112 years. But what is the Federal Reserve? When I was working in news in Los Angeles, I was on my way to a story, driving down the 405. There had been news that day about the Fed doing something or other, probably raising interest rates. And I turned to the reporter next to me and I said, you know, it's a shame something like a private bank can have such control over our economy. The reporter said, what? What do you mean? And I said, well, the Federal Reserve, it's a private bank. It makes a profit off of American people, millions and millions of dollars every day. The reporter said, what? You're crazy. The Fed, it's not private. It's a branch of the government. I almost lost control of the news van. This reporter in Los Angeles, the second largest market in our country. And by the way, he was our money reporter. He actually said branch of the government. I laughed. I said to him, Alan, branch of the government? As in like the executive branch or the judicial branch? Yeah, he said, just like that. Well, folks, that was a lesson for me. I knew it was complicated, but I had no idea what a hidden secret our entire economy revolved around. Those bills in your wallet, everything you earn, everything you spend, look closely. They say Federal Reserve. I guess we've all gotten used to that, but, well, who cares, right? A dollar is a dollar. Well, let me back up a little bit. The first thing I need to do is have a little history lesson. Bear with me because this sets the table. It's the start of our understanding of the most purposely confusing aspects of our society. Okay, let's go back to the year 1693 in England. King William and his predecessors have had the British at war continuously for the better part of 50 years. To pay for this never-ending war, the kings have been taxing the hell out of the British population, to the point where the king, he faces a rebellion if he so much as asks for another penny in taxes. So what's a king to do? He has a war to fight and no money to pay for it. Well, in walks a kind of shady character named William Paterson. This is a guy from Scotland. Mr. Paterson has an idea. He gets together with the king and a bunch of other government types, and they come up with something called the Bank of England. You may have heard about it. Well, this is where it gets interesting. The king orders that the Bank of England has the exclusive right to create and print money as legal tender that must be accepted by everyone. Then the Bank of England creates, out of nothing, British currency. Say, in the case of an example, just for an example, we'll say £1 million. The bank then lends this newly found cash to none other than the king's government at a convenient 8% interest rate, I might add. The king turns around and gives the bank an IOU for this £1 million. Now that IOU, backed by the government, becomes an asset for the bank. And this asset now is something that the bank can turn around and legally use to loan out to the general public as much as 10 times its value, while of course collecting another 8% interest on each one of those 10 million additional pounds. Brilliant. The king has his money to continue his war without raising taxes. The bank creates money out of thin air at no cost and loans it to the king and gets 8% interest on something that, again, didn't cost them anything, and then gets to loan out another 10 times that original amount, collecting another 8% on each of those loans. Oh, by the way, did I mention that this private Bank of England sold stock to stockholders? And you might have guessed it, the king, several of his friends, Mr. Patterson, and some government officials just happened to be the ones who bought up all that stock and the bank. That, my friends, sets the table. What a fantastic way to solve everyone's problem, except, of course, for the English people. You see, when you create money out of nothing and throw it into the existing money supply, every one of those dollars or pounds you had is worth less. It's called inflation, and that's a tax. Although a well-hidden one, the people end up paying. So on with our story. Fast forward. It's now 1910. The banking powers in the US, in the Northeast specifically, centered around New York City. Basically, they have a problem. See, throughout the country, there are thousands and thousands of banks. Anyone basically can start a bank and begin loaning money. As long as they have the proper assets and follow a few rules, they're in business. Business that competes with the big city guys in New York. And these guys don't like competition. They see themselves, they want themselves in a better, stronger position. But how do they minimize competition? Good question, right? Well, in November of 1910, 7 guys who represented the richest, most powerful banking families in New York secretly got on a private train car attached to a train heading south. The destination for these guys was a private resort on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. So who were these guys? Well, here's a list. Henry Davison, senior partner, J.P. Morgan Company. Frank Vanderlip, president of the Rockefeller-owned National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust. Charles Norton, president of the First National Bank of New York. Abraham Andrew, assistant secretary of the U.S. Treasury. Paul Warburg, senior partner in Kuhn and Loeb, a German banker relocated to New York, and he's representing the Rothschild family. And then there's a guy named Nelson Aldrich. He's a U.S. senator and head of the National Monetary Commission, who also just happened to be John D. Rockefeller's father-in-law and uncle of a guy named Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, who just happened to eventually go on and become governor of New York and then vice president. So there you have it. A very rich, very powerful group headed to the Rockefeller summer home on Jekyll Island. They spent a week or two coming up with a scheme to drive all the little guys out of the banking business, and at the same time, make themselves even more rich and much, much more powerful. They came up with the perfect plan, much like the guy, Mr. Patterson, in England before them. But there was a catch. They desperately wanted to keep this plan a little bit quiet, or they at least wanted it to sound official, trustworthy. So after much deliberation, they decided that the word bank should not be associated with a name in any way, shape, or form. Instead, in order to make this sound official and responsible, the Federal Reserve was born. Now, it took some maneuvering, some lobbying, and 3 years to get their plan approved. But on December 23rd, 1913, late at night, the few congressmen still in town before the Christmas break pushed through the Federal Reserve Act. The supposed purpose of this newly formed Federal Reserve was to control and stabilize the US dollar. They do this by regulating and controlling our money supply. That means those dollars in your pocket don't exist unless the Fed prints them and loans them to the federal government to circulate to you and businesses around the country. And then our government gives the Fed an IOU. Basically, they call it a government bond. Yes, the government bonds go to the Fed as collateral for the loan of money that the Fed created out of nothing, thin air. Are we getting the picture? Does this sound familiar? I've wanted to do this show for a very long time. It's been tough. If you get on the internet, or if you ask any professor who's supposed to be an expert on the economy, you do any research anywhere at all, you will get the most frustrating, confusing doublespeak you could ever imagine. Oh, and another little interesting tidbit on this $20 Federal Reserve note. There's a picture of Andrew Jackson, our country's 7th president. I think that might be somebody's insider version of giving the middle finger to the United States. You see, in the 1830s, a national bank, much like the Fed, had been started and was up for certification by Congress. Jackson saw this central bank as a scam that would be a disaster for the country and put a group of unelected scoundrels unconstitutionally in charge of everything. He put a stop to it, and he swore there would be no central bank in this country. And oh, by the way, the last time the federal government had no debt, zero, was January 8th, 1835, under President Jackson. I don't think he'd be very happy today. So, in the 112 years since the Fed has gained power, was given the task of stabilizing our economy, how's that been working out? Well, let's take a look at just one measure. If you had a dollar in this country in 1790, that dollar would, in 1912, the year before the Fed took over, that dollar would have been worth $1.05. In other words, there was absolutely no inflation, none to speak of, for the first 124 years of this country's existence. The dollar lost no value at all. In fact, there was a slight gain in value. Now, the Fed takes over with a mandate to stabilize that wildly unstable dollar. If you had a dollar in 1913, that dollar today would be worth, hold on to your hat, 3 cents, 3 pennies. In other words, since the Federal Reserve has been in charge of our money, our supposedly stabilizing Federal Reserve, the dollar has lost 97% of its value. When we come back, we'll talk about why you have not heard any of this story, or for that matter, any complaints from either Democrats or Republicans. Stay right where you are. So welcome back to this big picture. I've been talking about the Federal Reserve, who came up with it, how it works, and how it's performed over its 112-year history. But what about today? Those original banking families are no longer around, right? Well, not exactly. This is where it gets a little fuzzy. Yes, the Federal Reserve is a private company. Their assets are between $6 and $10 trillion at any given time. We're led to believe that they answer to Congress, that they somehow are quasi-official. And at the same time, we're told that the Fed has to remain independent, not influenced by our government at all. Well, which is it? Either they're independent or they answer to Congress. Once again, the word confusion creeps into the subject. In reality, the Fed is comprised of 12 Federal Reserve banks. These banks are owned by companies such as BlackRock, Vanguard, Citibank, and JP Morgan. They're all profit-making companies. And the presidents of these 12 banks get together with 7 bureaucrats called Federal Reserve Board members who are appointed by the president but not controlled by the president or anyone in government. And together, they decide policy. In other words, interest rates. Again, independent, official, there's no simple answer. And if you wanted to start a bank today in this country, you would be forced by law to buy stock in this private Federal Reserve and comply with their rules and their control. That stock, though, would get you what is called just a membership. It's no voting rights and it's no ownership rights. And the stock can't be sold or transferred. In other words, it's basically a fee. Banks are paying a fee to the Federal Reserve and dividends to become part of this controlled banking monopoly. So, in effect, the Fed has succeeded in the original purpose. They've eliminated the competition and now control all banking in the US. The Fed is essentially a banking cartel. In the news these days, we do hear a lot about the Fed. We hear about how they carefully manage inflation, how they help all of us with fiscal stability, how it doesn't get involved with politics, or more recently, there's been a political tug of war about high interest rates. But what we don't hear is anything about the Fed being a private profit-making company or creating money out of nothing. Why don't we hear any of that? Well, there's a good reason, and we'll get to that shortly. Most of us listen to the news of the Fed, and I admit it, we kind of glaze over. That's beyond our immediate concerns. We have to worry about our work, our families, putting food on the table. So when we don't hear the story behind the story, well, who's got time to even think about it? All that is planned. It's part of the system. If they keep us so busy trying to survive, and they make the system so complicated, so confusing, you won't have a chance to question anything. That's the American way. That's another different but complementary element to what we're talking about here. You see, in today's world, our government has gotten so large, our people so burdened by taxes and fees and regulations, that most of us just don't have the time or energy to question things. Here's just a little piece of history. In 1943, Vice President Harry Truman had a staff of 4 people. In 1995, Tipper Gore, wife of the vice president, had as many as 50 people working for her at any given time. In 1950, the average American worker paid around 3% of their annual income to the federal government. And did you know that as late as 1965, there was no sales tax here in New York? We're in Erie County, nothing. Today, although we're not encouraged to think about it, the average American, between property taxes and school taxes and utility taxes and Social Security taxes, we ultimately pay more than 50% of our earnings to one government or another. Bureaucracy is a living, breathing thing. It survives, it gains strength through making life for people more complicated. Another example, the Lord's Prayer is 66 words. The Gettysburg Address was 286 words. There are 1,322 words in the Declaration of Independence. But the federal regulations for the sale of cabbage in this country, there's 29,911 words. All this bureaucracy, just so our brilliant public officials can step in and save us from things like, climate change. They come up with the war on poverty or the Green New Deal just to help us to survive. The very complications that they themselves imposed. So when you hear a politician yelling, we can't cut benefits to programs, remember, they're the same politicians who invented the need for these programs and ordered us to take part. Okay, look, I get carried away. But how does all this connect? Well, back to the Fed and why you never hear anything about what I just explained. Why don't our trusted public officials ever complain about the Fed? Well, let's think about it. In 2021, President Biden added almost $5 trillion to the economy through various spending programs. The question for today's conversation is, where did that money come from? And the answer, as you may have guessed, is the Federal Reserve created those $5 trillion out of thin air. Now, in 2020, our gross domestic product, the overall financial value of the entire US economy, was $20 trillion. When you add an extra $5 trillion created out of nothing, adding no goods, no services, to a $20 trillion economy, every single dollar that already existed suddenly had a buying power of about 75 cents. That's inflation. You were hit by massive inflation, a hidden tax. And what did the Fed say? They said that there was inflation because businesses were raising prices. Or you were spending like drunken sailors, and they had to get everyone to slow down their irresponsible behavior. Let's just think about that for a minute. I'm not sure about you, but I personally don't know anyone who was on a crazy spending spree, throwing cash around just for the hell of it in 2021. No one, that is, who wasn't a politician. It might be damn convenient that the Fed can point to you, the American citizen, or to private businesses and say, it's your fault that we have to save you from yourself. So even to this day, the Fed says inflation is a problem and spending is the cause. So they have to keep interest rates high to keep you from throwing your money around recklessly. Again, I'm not throwing my money around recklessly, throwing it out the window just for the hell of it. Are you? But still, the Fed says there's inflation. So how can that be? There's no $5 trillion government programs. In fact, Trump is trying to cut waste and cut spending. So why would we still have inflation? Well, if you want to get a mortgage or maybe a car loan or use your credit card, you're paying more, spending more, because the Fed is taking more of your money in the form of higher interest rates. If businesses have to pay higher interest rates for their dealings, they have to pass those costs along in the form of higher prices or go out of business. In other words, the brilliant Fed governors who always know best might just be causing the inflation with the interest rates that they are imposing on you to lower inflation. That makes my head spin. The truth that ultimately is you, the American citizen, bear the costs for everything. You know, we can complain, we can suffer with high interest rates, we can suffer with the hidden tax of inflation, but you know who's not suffering, who's not complaining? Elected officials. Those people who we trust to do the right thing. So why don't we hear any complaints about who the Fed is or how things work? Because, my friends, the simple answer is that the Fed is the piggy bank for the politician, the golden goose. When the Fed gives them all the money they want to throw around, our politicians wisely keep their mouths shut. We all know that officials at all levels don't spend their own money. Somehow, when the money you spend belongs to other people, it's easier to be wasteful, to be generous. And being generous when you're a politician buys you votes. You get respect, you get friends, you get to keep your job. And the cycle continues. I'm not saying that all public officials are affected, that they don't care. All I'm saying is that there is a system in place, and that system is not necessarily there for our direct benefit. So why go into all this when the Fed and the system in general are so entrenched? What's the point of me spending the last half hour going into all of this? Well, there's an old saying that I still happen to believe in: knowledge is power. A lot of you out there won't or can't do anything with the knowledge we've discussed on the show, but sharing it costs nothing. Some of you will use the power of voting to try and improve things. Some of you may actually reach out to your elected officials. Individually, we can't do all that much, but as a group, informed and concerned, our numbers add up. With knowledge, anything can happen. It may start small, but if enough people try to cut through the confusion, there might be hope. Look, don't trust anything I've said and covered on this show in this last half hour. Look into it. Do your own research. In today's world, it's becoming easier to ask the right questions. The powers that be will still try to bury things to confuse the issue, but there are sources out there that can cut through all the bull. This show could be a start, and the most I can ask for is that you carry on the conversation. Anyway, that's it for this big picture. Thank you for watching the big picture, and thank you for watching WBBZ-TV. Hopefully this was informative. We'll see you on the next big picture.